His hand was on her waist before either of them had decided that was allowed. It lasted 3 seconds. 3 seconds of his palm warm and certain against the curve of her. 3 seconds of her breath catching in a way she could not explain away. 3 seconds of him looking down at her with an expression that had nothing professional left in it. And then someone called his name from across the room and the moment broke and they stepped apart and Zara Elaine Mosley turned back to the garment rack in front of her and pressed one hand flat against the fabric hanging there and told herself very firmly that she was fine. She was not fine. But we are getting ahead of ourselves. Because this story doesn't start with his hand on her waist. It starts 3 weeks earlier, in a boardroom on the 14th floor of Callaway Creative Group in Atlanta, Georgia, on the morning that Declan Harrow walked into the building and noticed the one woman who was not trying to be noticed. And before we go any further, if you are new here, please take just 1 second right now to subscribe, like this video, and share it with someone who loves a story that feels like something real. This channel is built on stories made specifically for you, and every single share helps this community grow into something beautiful. Now, let's go back to that boardroom, because everything that is about to happen starts there. And none of it is going to go the way either of them planned. It was a Monday morning in late October and the 14th floor of Callaway Creative had the particular energy of a place that has been warned that important company is coming and has spent the weekend making itself presentable. Everything was slightly too neat. Everyone was slightly too composed. The break room had real coffee. The design team had printed their presentations on the good paper. 3 people had gotten haircuts over the weekend. Declan Harrow had been in the building for 11 minutes and he had already noticed all of it. He sat at the head of the conference table in a dark navy suit, no tie, a quality of stillness about him that was not relaxed and not tense but something more unsettling than either, the stillness of someone who is absorbing considerably more than they are showing. He was 35 years old and he had the kind of face that made people want to explain themselves before he asked them to. Not because he was unkind, because he was precise. Because his eyes moved through a room the way a hand moves through still water, feeling everything, disturbing nothing, leaving no visible trace of what they had found. The lead design team was presenting the quarterly review. For designers at the front of the room, voices bright and rehearsed and pitched at the specific frequency of people performing confidence for someone whose opinion of them matters too much. Every person in that room was angled toward Declan. Every head tilted slightly in his direction. Every posture calibrated to register as capable and unthreatened. Every person except the woman standing at the back of the room. He had seen her the moment he walked in. He had not been obvious about it. He was never obvious about anything. But she had stopped him for exactly 1 beat longer than anyone else in the sweep he did of every new room. And he had filed it and returned to the business of the morning and told himself it was nothing. He looked back twice before the presentation started. She was wearing a rich plum blazer over a fitted black dress, a delicate gold chain at her throat, her natural hair out in a full defined twist out that framed her face with the quiet authority of someone who understood exactly what they were doing. She was full-figured and she stood the way certain women stand, like the decision to stand like this had been made a long time ago and was not up for revisitation. She had a notebook open in one hand and a pen moving across the page in the focused rhythm of someone actually thinking. She was not watching the presentation slides. She was not watching Declan. She was the only person in the room who appeared entirely indifferent to his presence. He found this, and he would not examine this word until much later, fascinating. The presentation was moving through its second section when it began to unravel. The lead designer, a man named Garrett with a practiced smile and the watch of someone who needed you to register his success, was walking through the structural rationale of the fall collection when Declan asked a question. He asked it quietly because quiet questions have nowhere to hide. He said, "The transition from the 3rd silhouette to the 4th. The design logic doesn't hold. Walk me through it." Garrett smiled, clicked to the next slide, opened his mouth. Nothing came out. The rationale did not exist in any retrievable form, and every person in the room understood this at exactly the same moment, and nobody moved, and the silence stretched like a wire pulled too tight. 2 seconds. For Declan waited with the patience of a man who had nowhere more important to be. And then a voice rose from the back of the room. The transition is deliberate dissonance. Every head turned. She had not moved. had not stepped forward or raised her hand or done a single thing to draw attention to herself. She was still standing in the same spot against the back wall, notebook in hand, pen between her fingers, one ankle crossed loosely over the other. Her voice was unhurried and completely certain in the way things are certain when they come from actual knowledge rather than preparation. The third silhouette is all control, she continued. High neck, defined shoulder, nothing gives. The fourth piece releases everything. Dropped shoulder, fluid hem, the fabric moves when the body moves. The contrast is intentional. The woman wearing it is supposed to feel the shift in her body before she consciously understands it. The collection tells a story about control and release, and that transition is exactly where the story turns. She finished. The room was completely silent. Declan turned last. He looked directly at her for the first time and she felt it before she processed it. That quality of attention he carried, the kind that arrived with actual weight, the kind you felt somewhere below the surface of your skin. She looked up from her notebook and met his eyes because she was not the kind of woman who looked away first from anything. He held her gaze. 3 full seconds. Direct and unreadable and completely, uncomfortably present. She held it for 2. Then she looked back down at her notebook like she had assessed him, found him unremarkable and moved on. Like he was furniture. Something happened in Declan Harrow's chest in that moment that he was entirely unprepared for. It was not attraction, not yet, not in any form he could name cleanly. It was the specific and deeply unfamiliar sensation of being looked at, evaluated, and set aside by someone who had clearly found other things more interesting. In 10 years of boardrooms and acquisitions and high-stakes negotiations, he could not locate a single comparable moment. He was aware, with something between irritation and amusement, that he wanted her to look back. She did not look back. He turned to Garrett. "Get me her name," he said quietly, and Garrett nodded without question. Zara slipped out in the second wave after the meeting, unhurried, heading for the elevator at the far end of the hall. She pressed the button and stood with her face neutral and her spine straight and told herself with complete firmness that the CEO of Harrow Group noticing her in a meeting was a professional non-event and she was going to treat it as exactly that. The elevator opened. She stepped in. The doors closed. She let out a breath that was considerably longer and slower than she was comfortable with. She was 25 years old and she had one plan. 7 months. That was all that stood between her and the fashion label she had been building in her apartment for the better part of 2 years. The label that was going to have her name on it, hers completely and undeniably, that no one was ever going to be able to take because it was never going to be in anyone else's hands. She had arrived at that plan through Marcus Vale. Marcus was her direct supervisor at Callaway. 41, immaculately dressed. The kind of smooth that presents as warmth until you have known someone long enough to feel the temperature underneath it. When Zara was 23 and new and still believed that talent was its own protection, she had made the mistake of trusting him with something real. She had spent 18 months developing a collection she called soft architecture. Garments that were structured on the outside and yielding at the core, clothes that held the body the way a well-built room holds light, that made the woman wearing them feel simultaneously protected and free. She had spread her sketchbooks across Marcus's desk one afternoon and talked for 2 hours, every detail of the concept laid bare, and he had leaned forward with his chin in his hands and said, she still heard it sometimes in the quiet of her apartment, "Zara, this is the most original thing I have seen in this building in years." For months later, Marcus Vale presented soft architecture at the industry's regional showcase. Under his own name, it won. His photograph ran in the trade publications. His salary increased. His reputation in the industry expanded in exactly the way a reputation expands when it is standing on someone else's foundation. Zara's name appeared nowhere. She went to the department director with documentation, timestamped sketchbooks, dated notebooks, email threads going back 18 months. The response was a 25-minute HR meeting and a form acknowledging the matter had been reviewed. She had not signed the form. She had also not left because leaving meant he won twice and she was not built to absorb that kind of loss twice. So she stayed. She moved her real work into her apartment. She gave Marcus exactly enough to keep him comfortable and the company satisfied. She saved every dollar above rent and groceries and the fabric she bought at the market on Saturdays. And she built the label in the margins of her real life, sketch by sketch, piece by piece, with her grandmother's photograph watching from above the desk and the 7-month countdown running in the back of every single day. She dressed every morning like a woman who knew exactly who she was. Jewel tones and well-fitted silhouettes that honored every curve of her body without apology. Bold earrings that moved when she moved. Silk blouses tucked just right. Colors and cuts that came from someone who understood fashion from the inside out and dressed accordingly. She looked intentional because she was intentional. She looked like herself because that had always been the only acceptable goal. Her friend Priya Okafor was 27, Nigerian American, and the sharpest person in any room she entered. She had appeared beside Zara in the break room during the second week of employment, said, "I saw your face during that presentation and I completely agree," handed her a coffee, and that had been the beginning of the only friendship inside Callaway that Zara trusted with anything real. It was Priya who found her at lunch after the Monday meeting. "The CEO asked Garrett for your name," Priya said, sitting down across from her with the careful energy of someone about to say something significant. "He's conducting an acquisition review," Zara said. "He's thorough. He watched you leave the room, Zara. He watches everything. He watched you like everything else in the room had stopped being interesting." Zara looked up from her sketchbook. She gave Priya the look, the steady, level, entirely decided look that Priya called the grandmother face because it reminded her of women who had made up their minds permanently. 7 months, Zara said. Priya pressed her lips together. "I hear you," she said. "I just want you to know that some things don't wait 7 months." "Mine will," Zara said. She went home that evening and sat at her kitchen table surrounded by fabric-covered walls and the stacked sketchbooks and her grandmother's face in the photograph above the desk. Posture straight as a column, chin level, eyes carrying something about dignity that no caption had ever improved on. And she drew for 3 hours and she was extremely disciplined about what she allowed herself to think about. Extremely disciplined. The individual portfolio reviews began Wednesday. Declan worked through the design team methodically, 2 or 3 per day, 45 minutes each, in the glass-walled conference room on the 14th floor that the team had taken to calling the fishbowl because you could see everything happening inside it and hear nothing at all. Zara was scheduled for Friday at 10. She dressed that morning with the specific intentionality she brought to anything that mattered. Deep rust-colored wide-leg trousers, a fitted ivory blouse tucked precisely at the waist, long gold earrings that caught the light when she moved. She looked like herself, clearly and unapologetically, which was always the point. She walked in at 10 o'clock exactly. He was standing at the window with his back to the door, hands in his pockets, looking at the Atlanta skyline in the way of someone working through a thought rather than observing a view. He turned when she entered and something moved across his face. Brief, quickly gathered, that she noted without reacting to. He gestured to the chair across from him. She sat. He sat. He opened her file. Standard questions for the first 10 minutes. Design process influences approach to collection development. She answered directly and without ornamentation, and he listened in the complete way he had. Not waiting for a pause to insert his own perspective, actually listening, his eyes on her face with the quality of someone keeping every word rather than just hearing it. Then he closed her file. He reached to the side of the table and opened a second folder and placed it flat between them. She looked down. Soft architecture. Her collection, fully documented, spread across the table. Her hands stayed still in her lap. "The design language in your portfolio," he said, "matches this work at a structural level that cannot be explained by influence or coincidence. The concept of external structure and internal yield is identical. It is the same mind at different stages of development." She did not move. "This collection is attributed to Marcus Vail. It won the regional showcase 19 months ago." He held her gaze. "Did you make this?" The question sat in the room like something that had been waiting to be asked for a very long time. She calculated. She was aware of him watching her calculate, watching her weigh the cost of honesty against the cost of silence in real time, right in front of him, and she understood from the quality of his stillness that he had already reached his conclusion and was simply waiting to see what she would do. "Marcus Vail is the designer of record on that collection," she said. He looked at her steadily. "That is not what I asked." The silence that followed was the most expensive of her professional life. "Is there anything else from my portfolio you would like to cover?" she said. Something moved through his expression. Not frustration. Something layered and quieter than frustration. Something that looked, for just a moment, like it cost him something too. "Not today," he said. She stood, gathered her portfolio, walked to the door. "Zara." She stopped, turned. He was still seated, one arm resting on the table, looking at her with an expression she could feel more clearly than she could read. "You answered that question Monday from the back of the room without stepping forward," he said. "Without needing anyone to know it came from you." A pause. "Why?" She looked at him for a moment. "Because the answer mattered more than the credit," she said. She left. She was 4 steps into the hallway when she heard him exhale, long and slow, and she walked faster without looking back. He found her in the archive room that evening. She was there at 8:30 with her blazer over the back of a chair, and her sleeves rolled to the elbows and fabric swatches spread across the long table in a gradient from ivory to deep gold. She had a sketchbook open and a pencil behind her ear, and she was holding a length of deep teal de peony, silk up toward the overhead light with both hands, turning it slowly, watching the color shift and deepen in the weave. She was humming something low, a half-remembered song from her grandmother's kitchen, Sunday mornings, the smell of good food and pressed fabric, and she was entirely, completely herself in the particular way she was only ever herself when no one was watching. She did not hear him come in. He stood in the doorway for longer than he should have. He told himself later he had simply been waiting for a natural moment to announce himself. He did not examine that explanation very carefully. What he saw was a woman fully inhabited by her own life, moving through the work she was born to do with an ease and completeness that most people spend their whole careers searching for. He stood there and he watched her, and the thought that arrived was simple and inconvenient and entirely true. He had never seen anyone like her. When she finally sensed the shift in the room and turned, he watched her compose herself. The quiet speed of it. Her whole self gathering in the time it took to lower her arm. 2 seconds less. And then she was standing there with her chin level and her eyes clear and nothing showing that she had not chosen to show. He found it remarkable. He found her remarkable. And he was beginning to have considerable difficulty pretending otherwise. "I didn't realize anyone was here," he said. "Third shelf left side," she said, nodding toward the reference archives. "If that's what you need." "Thank you." He crossed to the shelf, found a folder, did not leave. "What are you working on?" he asked. "Personal project." He looked at the sketchbook on the table. Even from across the room, the lines were alive and original and dense with intention. He wanted to cross the room and look at it properly. He stayed where he was. "Can I see?" A pause. A beat of silence with something warm inside it. "No," she said. He looked at her. Something moved at the corner of his mouth. Fair enough. He should have left. He stayed another 40 minutes. They talked about design theory, about what makes fashion concepts endure versus disappear, about whether a garment's first obligation is to the body wearing it or the eye observing it. She had opinions that were specific and rigorously held, and she delivered them with a directness that had no edge in it whatsoever. She was the most genuinely interesting person he had spoken to in longer than he wanted to calculate, and at some point he realized he had stopped thinking about the acquisition entirely and was simply present. In a room with a woman who was talking about fabric like it was philosophy and making him feel like it was. When he finally moved to leave, he stood at the door for a moment. "Good night, Zara." The way her name sat in his mouth, like he had been thinking it rather than reading it off a file. "Good night," she said, without looking up from her sketchbook. He left. She put both hands flat on the table. She stayed very still and listened to his footsteps fade down the hallway and then disappear entirely, and then she breathed, long and deliberate, and looked at the teal silk still on the table and told herself with decreasing conviction that this was manageable. He came back Tuesday. He came back Thursday. Each time with a reason. Each time staying considerably past the point where the reason could justify it. Their conversations moved from professional surfaces into deeper water without either of them naming the transition. Design philosophy, the industry, the difference between work that endures and work that merely succeeds, things that required actual thinking rather than performance. He made her tea on Thursday without asking, brought it from the break room and set it beside her sketchbook, and she looked at the cup and then at him and said nothing, and he sat down and they talked until 10:30. Priya was waiting by the elevator when she finally came up. She did not say anything immediately. She simply looked at Zara with the particular expression of someone who has already formed a complete opinion and is deciding how much of it to deliver. "He made me tea," Zara said before Priya could start. "I know. I saw him at the kettle. It doesn't mean anything." "Zara." Priya turned to face her fully. CEOs of acquiring companies do not go to break rooms and make tea and carry it down hallways. That is not a thing that happens. That is not in any professional handbook anywhere. She paused. "That man is in that archive room every other night because of you, and you know it, and I know it, and I think somewhere in that sketchbook you have probably drawn it." Zara pressed the elevator button. 7 months, she said. "Some things," Priya said quietly. "Do not wait 7 months." The elevator opened. Zara stepped in. She turned and looked at her friend through the closing doors, and she did not say anything else, but something in her face did. And Priya saw it. And the doors closed between them. That night at her kitchen table, surrounded by everything she had been building, Zara sat with her pencil still and looked at her grandmother in the photograph for a long time. She did not draw anything. She just sat there and acknowledged to herself, quietly and honestly, that something was happening that she had not planned for and could not fully control, and that the 7-month plan had not accounted for a man who made tea without being asked and listened like every word was worth keeping. She picked up her pencil. She drew until midnight. The archive room on Wednesday of the second week was different from the beginning. He arrived after 9, later than usual, and there was something in him that evening she had not seen before. A looseness at the edges of his composure, the faint marks of a day that had cost something. He sat down on the other side of the table without asking, which was new, and he leaned back and looked at the ceiling for a moment with an expression that was entirely unguarded and entirely human, and it undid something careful inside her chest before she could stop it. She watched him. "Hard day?" she said. It came out quiet and genuine and slightly domestic, and she felt the realness of it leave her mouth and could not pull it back. He looked at her. Something shifted in his expression, like the question had caught him off guard in a way he found unexpectedly good. "The board is pushing to accelerate the timeline," he said. "They want the acquisition decision in 10 days. And you don't want to be rushed. I want to do it right." A pause. His eyes on her face. "There are things in this building worth protecting, and I'm not going to sign off before I'm certain they're protected." He said it plainly. But the way he looked at her when he said it was not about the board or the acquisition at all, and the air in the room changed in a way that required more careful breathing. She looked down at the swatch in her hands. "I think," she said slowly and clearly, "that you should stop coming to the archive room." The room went very still. "Zara, I'm not saying it to be difficult." She kept her voice even and her eyes on the fabric. "I'm saying it because I know what this is becoming and I cannot afford it. I have something I am 7 months from finishing, and I need to protect it, and I need to protect myself, and the last time I let someone in this building get close to something I was building, I lost it." She paused. "I'm not willing to pay that again." Silence. "I'm not Marcus Vale," he said. His voice was low and careful and had something underneath the care that was not entirely controlled. "I know that," she said. "Do you?" She looked up at him then, directly, with 2 years of learning exactly what those words cost when they turned out not to be true. "I know you're not him," she said quietly. "But knowing that doesn't change the math. You leave in 2 weeks. I stay here. And whatever this is." She stopped, pressed her lips together. "Whatever this is doesn't survive that math." A long silence. He looked at her for a moment with something in his face that was not defeat and not acceptance but contained both of them. And then he said, quietly, "Okay." He stood, picked up his folder, walked to the door. He paused there with his back to her. "For the record," he said, and his voice had something raw at the edges that she felt rather than heard, "I have not come to this room every evening to look at reference material." He left. She sat alone with the swatches fanned across the table and the overhead light warm on everything and the silence so large she could hear her own heartbeat inside it. And she did not move for a very long time. He stayed away from the archive room. She had asked him to, and he did, completely and without visible complaint. And she told herself for 3 days that she was relieved, and on the 4th day she stopped telling herself things she did not believe. The all-hands meeting came on a Tuesday. Marcus Vale stood at the front of the room in the way he always stood, comfortably, as though the space had been arranged with him specifically in mind. The showcase announcement, he said. The centerpiece of the acquisition decision. A concept he had been developing that represented the most significant work of his career. He clicked to the first slide. Zara's hands went flat in her lap. She knew every line on that slide. She knew the silhouette logic and the color progression and the structural concept the way you know your own handwriting. Not because you are looking at it, but because it came out of you. This was the collection she had been building in her apartment for 14 months. In her own time. In notebooks that had never entered this building. The foundation of the label. The thing she had kept most carefully separate from Calloway and from Marcus and from everyone in this room. She had left a sketchbook on her desk 3 weeks ago. One sketchbook for 2 hours on a Saturday afternoon, and Marcus had been in the office and the book had been exactly where she left it when she came back, and she had thought nothing of it. She understood now. The volcanic thing rose in her chest, hot and enormous and ancient. And she held it with both hands pressed flat against her thighs, and she sat through the entire presentation without making a sound. 30 people in this room who did not know what they were witnessing. The board liaison on screen from New York. And Declan Harrow seated at the side of the room, very still, watching her face. She did not look at him. She held the volcanic thing and she breathed and she kept her chin level and her face giving away nothing, and when the presentation ended she stood with everyone else and she walked out at a normal pace and she went directly to the women's bathroom and locked herself in the second stall. She pressed her forehead against the cool tile. She allowed herself 90 seconds. She counted every single one. At 90 she stepped back, fixed her lip gloss, straightened her blazer, lifted her chin and looked at herself in the mirror with the clear-eyed honesty her grandmother had taught her. Not judgment, acknowledgement. You are still here. You are still standing. You know what to do. She picked up her bag and walked out. Declan was in the hallway, not waiting. He was simply there, walking in the opposite direction, and they passed each other the way people pass in hallways. But as they passed he looked at her, and what was in his face was not professional and was not neutral. It said, I saw everything in that room and I know what it cost you. It said, I am not pretending otherwise. She held his eyes for 1 second. Then she walked away. At 8:47 that evening a calendar notification arrived on her phone. D. Harrow. No subject. 7 a.m. tomorrow. Conference room 4. She stared at it in the dark of her apartment for a long time. She accepted it. She did not sleep. The morning meeting. Early light coming soft through the windows. Him across the table, no file open, no phone, no tablet. Just a folder to his right that he slid toward her without preamble. Her archive files beside Marcus's showcase slides. Side by side. Time-stamped. 14 months of her work laid against everything he had presented yesterday. The comparison so clear and complete that looking at it felt like a window thrown open in a room that had been sealed too long. How did he get the new concept? Declan said. Quiet and direct. She told him about the sketchbook. 3 weeks ago. 2 hours on a Saturday. Then she told him everything else. The original collection. The showcase. The HR meeting. The form she had not signed. The label. The 7 months. And then she told him, her voice going quieter here, going somewhere that cost her, that she had stayed silent because she had understood from the day of that HR meeting that the industry she loved was not built to protect her specifically, and she had made the calculation that surviving inside it mattered more than fighting battles that had no guaranteed outcome. He listened to every word. He did not interrupt once. When she finished he leaned forward slightly and said, He took from you twice. Yes. And you stayed both times. Yes. Because leaving felt like letting him win. Her throat tightened. Yes. A silence. Then, low and direct, leaning forward. What do you want, Zara? Not what's safe. Not what gets you to 7 months. What do you actually want? She looked at him across the table in the early morning light, and she felt the question land in every locked place inside her, and she knew she was in the most dangerous moment she had faced in 2 years. Not because of Marcus, not because of the showcase, but because of this man and this question and the way he was looking at her like the answer was the only thing in the room. "I want my work back," she said. "My name on it. In front of everyone. Done. No pause. No qualification. And I want—" She stopped. He waited. She looked at him for a long moment. "That's enough for now," she said. He held her gaze. "For now," he said. What followed was swift and thorough and final. Marcus's showcase concept was pulled and attributed correctly with full documentation distributed to the board and all relevant department heads. Marcus Vale's employment was terminated that Thursday with the particular finality of someone whose authority is absolute and whose patience has run completely out. Zara found out through the official memo like everyone else. She read it at her desk. Read it twice. Pressed her fingertips to her mouth for a moment and looked at the wall and felt 2 years of held weight shift inside her chest into something that did not yet have a name but was large and clean and real. Priya put a hand on her shoulder. Zara covered it with her own hand. Neither of them said anything, and it was exactly right. The rest of the floor was not quiet. She felt the eyes finding her in the way she always felt eyes, with the specific awareness of someone who has trained herself to be invisible and therefore always knows when she has been seen. She kept her posture straight and her face composed and returned to her screen and told herself it was over. It was not over. Clifton Vries had been on the Callaway board for 22 years. He was 70 years old and old Atlanta money, and he had been Marcus Vale's most reliable advocate for a decade, which meant that Marcus's termination was not, to Clifton Vries, a conclusion. It was an offense. Within 48 hours Vries had organized something. It came to a head on a Friday afternoon in the large conference room on the 14th floor during what had been scheduled as a routine showcase logistics meeting. 12 people around the table. The board liaison on video from New York. Declan at the head of the room. Zara 3 seats down on the left side. Her collection layout documents open in front of her. Vries was not supposed to be in this meeting. He walked in 4 minutes after it started and sat down without apology, and the room absorbed his presence with the careful neutrality of people who understood that something was about to happen. He waited until the meeting had moved to the showcase attribution section. And then Clifton Vries, 70 years old and entirely comfortable with the power of his own name, looked across the table at Zara Elaine Mosley and said, in the pleasant measured tone of someone who has practiced something, "Before we proceed, I think the board deserves transparency about the nature of the relationship between Ms. Mosley and the reviewing CEO, and how that relationship may have influenced the investigative conclusions of the past 2 weeks." The room stopped. Every person at that table stopped. Zara felt the words land on her skin like something physical. She felt every eye in the room move to her face. She felt the particular quality of a silence that is waiting to see what a woman does when she is publicly humiliated in a professional space. She did not move. She kept her hands flat on the table and her chin level, and she looked at Clifton Vries with eyes that were completely, devastatingly clear. She did not speak. She did not need to, because Declan Harrow spoke first. He did not raise his voice. He never raised his voice. But what came out of him in that moment had a quality she had never heard from him before. Something that was not boardroom precision and was not professional neutrality. Something that had heat in it. Real heat. The kind that comes from something being crossed that should not have been crossed. "Mr. Vries," he said. Quiet. Absolute. "You will retract that implication. Now. In this room. In front of everyone currently in it." Vries smiled. The smile of a man who believes his tenure makes him bulletproof. "I'm simply raising a legitimate question about process. You are making a public accusation about a member of this team's character," Declan said, "without a single piece of supporting evidence, in a room full of her colleagues, and you will retract it. The investigation that overturned a 2-year-old HR decision and terminated a senior supervisor in under a week raises reasonable questions. The investigation," Declan said, and his voice had dropped to something very quiet and very final, "produced timestamp documentation going back 14 months that was so comprehensive and so unambiguous that the only question it raised was why it took this company 2 years to look at what was directly in front of them." He paused. "The answer to that question reflects considerably worse on this board than it does on Zara Mosley." Complete silence. Vries's smile had gone uncertain. I want to be very clear, Declan continued, still quiet, still controlled, but with something underneath the control that was entirely present and entirely unmistakable, about what the documentation shows. Ms. Mosley developed the original soft architecture collection over 18 months. She brought it to a supervisor who presented it as his own. She raised a formal complaint with documentation that was dismissed by this company's own HR process. She then spent 2 years continuing to produce extraordinary work in a building that systematically failed to protect her. He looked around the table slowly. That is what the documentation shows. If anyone in this room has a question about the investigation's integrity, I will answer it directly. But I will not sit here while implications are made about this woman's character in place of an honest conversation about this company's failures. The room was so quiet Zara could hear the air conditioning. She was looking at Declan. She was looking at him and she was feeling something she had no immediate word for. Something that moved through her entire body slowly, from the center outward, like light moves through a room when a door opens. Something warm and enormous and slightly devastating in the way that things are devastating when they are also a relief. Nobody had ever done that. In 2 years. In every room she had sat in and said nothing and held the volcanic thing and carried herself because she was the only one guaranteed to do it. Nobody had ever stood up in a room full of people and said her name like it was worth defending. Vries left the meeting shortly after. The meeting continued. Zara looked at her layout documents and kept her face composed and got through the remaining 40 minutes with the same professionalism she brought to everything. And when it was over and people began gathering their things and the room began to empty, she stayed seated and looked at the table and breathed. Most people left. Declan was speaking to the board liaison, wrapping up the formal business of the meeting. Priya appeared at Zara's elbow and crouched down beside her and said nothing. Just looked at her face with eyes that were very bright. And Zara looked at her friend and shook her head very slightly, and Priya nodded and squeezed her arm once and stood up and left. When the room was empty except for the two of them, Declan ended the video call and closed his laptop. He looked at her across the now empty table. She looked back at him. Neither of them spoke for a moment. Then she said, quietly and honestly, "Thank you." He shook his head slightly. Like thank you was not the right currency for what had just happened, and he did not want it. It was the truth, he said simply. Someone should have said it 2 years ago. She looked at him for a long moment. Something was pressing very hard against the walls she had built, and for the first time in 2 years she was not entirely sure she wanted to hold them. She gathered her documents. She stood. Declan. He looked at her. I know what you did in there wasn't. She stopped. Started again. I know you didn't do that because of what's between us. I know you did it because it was right. She paused. But I want you to know that She stopped again. He waited. She pressed her lips together. 7 months just got a lot harder, she said quietly, and she left before she said anything she could not take back. The showcase prep officially began the following Monday. Zara came in early and stayed late and worked with the ferocious focused energy of someone who understands that they have been handed something extraordinary and intends to honor it with everything they have. The prep space on the 12th floor became her world. Rolling racks and high ceilings, and the smell of new fabric and the collection taking shape piece by piece, becoming more itself with every passing day. On Monday evening he appeared in the doorway. She was pinning the back panel of the green dress, the one with the drape she had drafted from the memory of her grandmother's church wrap, with her sleeves rolled up and a line of pins between her lips. She looked up when she felt the room change and found him standing in the doorway with his jacket over his arm. She removed the pins from her mouth. You should not be in here before the formal review. I know, he said. He did not move from the doorway. She looked at him for a moment. Come in or don't, she said, and turned back to the panel. He came in. He sat on the low bench against the wall and he watched her work, and he did not pretend he was there for any other reason. She was aware of his attention with a precision that she had stopped trying to ignore, aware of exactly where his eyes were, which was always on her, and aware that the quality of it was not assessment or cataloging but simply presence. The particular presence of someone who is exactly where they chose to be. They talked while she worked. It moved from easy to deep without transition, the way conversations do when both people have stopped managing the depth. He told her about building his first company at 26 on a single acquisition and a considerable amount of stubbornness. She told him about the first garment she ever made, age 14, on her grandmother's sewing machine. A skirt that was structurally improbable and completely unwearable, and the most important thing she had ever constructed. He laughed. A real laugh, low and warm and entirely unlike his boardroom voice. And it landed in her chest and stayed there like something that had been looking for that exact spot. At some point, she needed a swatch from the table beside him. He reached it before she did and held it out. Their fingers made contact. Warm and brief and entirely real. Not an accident and not quite deliberate. The particular kind of contact that happens when two people have been careful for long enough that careful slips for just a moment. His fingers against hers for 2 seconds before she took the swatch, and he released it, and they both returned to what they were doing as though nothing had changed. Everything had changed. She pinned the swatch into place with hands that were steady through an act of pure will, and she did not look at him, and he did not say anything, and the room held the moment between them like cupped hands holding water. That night, walking to her car, she stopped on the sidewalk in the cool October air, and she looked up at the Atlanta sky, and she allowed herself to acknowledge, fully and without qualification, that she was falling. Had been falling. That the 7-month plan had been built by a woman who had not yet met this specific man, and that woman had not accounted for archive rooms or tea made without asking or a conference table, and a man who said someone should have said it 2 years ago like it was simply, obviously true. She stood there for a moment. Then she got in her car. She drove home. She sat at her kitchen table and she opened her sketchbook and she drew her grandmother's church wrap from memory. The way the fabric had draped on Sunday mornings. The way it had made a woman who worked hard all week look like she was wearing her own dignity. She drew it into the green dress. And she let herself feel, quietly and privately, that she was no longer entirely sure she wanted the walls to hold. The showcase coordination meeting happened the following Wednesday. 12 people in the large prep room. Rolling racks along the walls. The collection arranged in sequence. Declan at the head of the room, the board liaison on video from New York. Zara 3 positions down the table with her sequence documents in front of her. It had been building for 20 minutes before it broke open. Declan had been pushing on the placement of the green dress, 3rd in the sequence versus 5th, arguing that the emotional arc needed a longer runway before the collection's most significant piece. Zara had explained the sequencing logic twice, clearly and completely, and he had pushed back again, and she had felt something sharpen in her the way something sharpens when you have explained a true thing correctly and are being asked to explain it a 3rd time to someone who has the authority to override it. The 3rd position is the whole point, she said. For the 3rd time, her voice still measured. The entire collection is structured around a turn at the midpoint. Move the green dress to 5th and you push the turn so late that the final 3 pieces have nothing to resolve. The sequence is the architecture. They are not separable. I understand the theory, Declan said. I'm questioning whether a general audience will track it without more context. The audience doesn't need to consciously track it. That's what the first 2 pieces are for. 2 pieces is not enough runway for the emotional investment you're asking for. She looked at him across the room. 12 people between them. The board liaison on screen. The collection on the racks around them bearing her name. With respect, she said, and her voice had gone to a place that was still professional but only by a very narrow margin. This is my collection. I have spent 14 months on the architecture of this sequence and I know precisely what it does and why it does it. I am not moving the green dress. A beat of silence. Something tightened in his expression. Small and fast and almost invisible. This showcase is the centerpiece of a significant acquisition decision, he said. I have a responsibility to the process. And I am telling you, as the person who designed and built every piece in this room, that the process is best served by the sequence as designed. I hear you. I am asking you to consider. You are not asking me to consider anything. Her voice was still level, but the temperature underneath it had changed into something real and old and not entirely about sequencing. You are telling me I am wrong about my own work, in front of my entire team, and I would like you to think about what that looks like from where I am standing. The room had gone completely still. Everyone was looking at the table or the racks or the floor, everywhere except at the 2 people on either side of this conversation. Something moved through Declan's expression that she did not read quickly enough. I am trying to make sure this succeeds, he said. Quietly. Too quietly. For whom? She said. And there it was. The thing underneath. The 2 years of sitting in the back of rooms. The HR meeting. The form. The award with someone else's name on it. The industry that was not built to protect her and had proven it repeatedly in rooms just like this one. Because in my experience, she said, still measured, still controlled, but entirely honest now, the people in this industry who have tried to ensure things succeed have had a very specific idea of whose success they were ensuring. And it was never mine. The silence that followed was total. She heard it. She heard exactly what she had said and exactly where it had landed, and she saw it land on his face. The specific moment the words registered not as professional pushback but as something aimed at him, the accusation inside the statement, and she saw something she had never seen on his face before. Hurt, real and unguarded, and there for 3 full seconds before he put it away. He looked at her for a moment. Then he said very quietly, "We'll keep the original sequence." And he turned to the board liaison and continued the meeting. She sat at the table for the remaining 30 minutes, and she did not look at him, and he did not look at her, and the 12 people around them moved through the agenda with the careful precision of people who had witnessed something real and were being very deliberate about not acknowledging it. After the meeting, the room cleared quickly. She stayed, straightening the racks, keeping her hands busy. She heard the last footsteps fade, and then there was only one set left, and they stopped near the door, and she knew without turning around. She kept her hands on the garment in front of her. "I shouldn't have said that," she said to the rack. "The last part, the way I framed it, that was yours and it wasn't fair." A long silence behind her. "No," he said. "It wasn't." She closed her eyes. She turned around. He was standing near the door with his jacket on and an expression she had not seen before. Not boardroom stillness. Not the archive room warmth. Something more exposed than either, something that was actively dealing with something and not fully succeeding. She looked at him and she felt the full weight of what she had said and what it had cost him, and the injustice of it sat in her chest alongside everything else. "You are not them," she said, quietly and clearly. "I know that. I have known that. And what I said in there was not about you. It was about every room before this one, and I put it on you, and that was wrong." He looked at her for a long moment. His jaw moved slightly. "I hear you," he said. And then, "And I need you to hear me." He paused. "I pushed on that sequence because I was wrong, and I should have listened the first time you explained it." Another pause, and this one was harder. "And I pushed harder than the sequence warranted because I am leaving in 1 week, and I was sitting in that room looking at your collection, knowing that when the showcase ends, my reason for being in this building ends with it, and I was..." He stopped. The room was very quiet. "I was not ready for that," he said, plainly and quietly, like a man saying a true thing that required effort to say. "And I took it out on your sequence, and I owe you an apology for that." She stood very still. She looked at this man who had stood up in a conference room full of people and said her name like it was worth defending, who was standing in front of her now saying something true that was difficult to say, and she felt the wall she had built and maintained and reinforced for 2 years sustain a fracture that she understood. Standing there was permanent. "Declan," she said. "Yeah. I need to get through the showcase," she said. 1 week. And then," she paused. "And then I need you to say what you've been not saying." He looked at her for a moment that stretched and held. "Okay," he said, low and steady and certain. He left. She stood in the prep room alone with the collection surrounding her, and she pressed both hands against the green dress on the rack, and she breathed through what was happening in her chest, and she let it happen. She stopped managing it. She just stood there and felt it. It was enormous. It was not something she was afraid of anymore. The night before the showcase, Vries made his final move. An email. 11 p.m. full board copied. 2 industry press contacts. The acquisition review had been compromised by a personal relationship between the CEO and a junior designer. An independent review was required. The showcase should be postponed pending that review. Zara saw it at 11:14 because Priya called her. She sat on her kitchen floor, back against the cabinet. The fabric walls around her and her grandmother above the desk and 14 months of her work in a prep room 12 floors up and everything she had built standing directly in front of a 70-year-old man's injured pride and his 22 years of board tenure. Her phone lit up. Declan. She answered on the second ring. I see it, she said. I know. His voice was immediate. Steady. But underneath the steadiness there was something she recognized now. Something controlled over something else. Something that cared. I have already spoken to 4 board members. Vries does not have the votes for a postponement. I am going to make sure of it tonight. It's 11 o'clock. I'm aware. Declan. She pressed the back of her head against the cabinet. If the showcase gets pulled. It is not getting pulled. But if it does. If he manages it somehow. I need you to know that what you did in that conference room last week. Her voice went slightly unsteady. Nobody has ever done that. I need you to know that regardless of what happens tomorrow. A silence. Not empty. The opposite of empty. Nothing is happening to the showcase, he said quietly. I am going to make sure of that tonight. And then tomorrow you are going to stand in front of that collection with your name on every piece and receive what has always been yours. A pause. Do you hear me? She pressed her lips together. I hear you, she said. Try to sleep. You try to sleep. I'll sleep when it's handled. She looked at the crack in her kitchen ceiling she had been meaning to report for months. At the fabric walls. At her grandmother above the desk. Chin level. Eyes clear. Posture straight as a lifelong promise. Declan. Yeah. She breathed. Thank you for not making me fight this alone, she said. And it came out soft and honest and entirely without armor, and she let it. A silence on his end that was so full it almost had a sound. Get some sleep, Zara, he said finally. His voice was something she was going to carry for a very long time. She stayed on the kitchen floor after they hung up. Not in distress. In something that had no clean name yet. Something warm and honest and larger than she had room for. Sitting in her apartment at 11 at night with everything she had built surrounding her. She got up, washed her face, went to bed. She did not sleep for a long time, but eventually she did. Vries's motion failed at 9:17 the following morning. The board had the votes. The showcase proceeded. 2 industry press contacts received a formal statement from Harrow Group Legal before 10. At 9:22 her phone showed a message from Declan. It's clear. Go get ready. She sat at her kitchen table and read it twice. Then she closed her phone and stood up and went to get dressed for the most important evening of her professional life. She dressed with the full ceremony of someone who understands what a garment can do and what an evening can mean. Deep emerald, her grandmother's color, Sunday morning color. The color she reached for when something was real and worth honoring. A structured off-shoulder dress that fit her body with the precision of something that had always been meant for exactly this body and this night. Her hair down and full and defined. Her grandmother's bracelet on her wrist. Gold earrings that caught the light when she moved. She stood in front of her mirror. She looked at herself the way her grandmother had taught her. Not judgment, acknowledgement. Not what do I look like, but here I am. I see you. I know you. You are ready. She looked like a woman arriving at something she had been walking toward her whole life. The converted warehouse was full and warm and lit in the way that makes everything look like it matters. Buyers and board members and industry contacts and press and people who had spent decades perfecting the ability to appear unmoved. Declan was near the entrance when she arrived. Their eyes found each other across the room and held. Not briefly, not professionally, but with the full, clear honesty of 2 people who had stopped pretending. One long, steady look that said everything that the week had not had room for. Then she moved to her position and the show began. The collection moved through the room like a breath being slowly released. Piece by piece. Silhouette by silhouette. The work she had built in her apartment at midnight and in her sketchbooks on Saturday mornings, and in the margins of a life she had been protecting for 2 years came out into the open air under her name, and the room changed. It did not happen loudly. It happened the way real things happen, quietly first, then all at once. People stopped performing their reactions and started having them. A buyer in the 4th row leaned forward. 2 board members exchanged a look that had nothing strategic in it. A woman near the runway had gone very still in the way people go still when something is reaching them somewhere they did not prepare to be reached. The green dress came out. The woman near the runway put her hand over her heart. Zara stood at the side of the runway and she watched her work move through the room and she felt the thing in her chest that had been locked for 2 years open so completely and so quietly that it was not like a break at all. It was like a window. Clean air coming in. Everything that had been sealed out finally allowed to enter. Her chin was level. Her eyes were clear. Her grandmother would have recognized her. At the back of the room, Declan Harrow watched her face for the entire show and did not look anywhere else. The room emptied slowly. The board moved through with loosened shoulders. Buyers gathered in conversation. The press filed out. Priya found Zara near the first rack and held both her hands and looked at her with eyes that were very bright and full and said, voice low and certain, "Your name. Every person in this room is leaving tonight knowing your name." She squeezed both hands once. Hard. And then she slipped away. And then the room was empty. The lights had gone warm and low and golden. The collection surrounded her on its stands and racks. Each piece exactly where she had placed it. Each seam exactly as she had sewn it. The ivory dress was in front of her, the final piece, the column dress with the single seam running shoulder to hem like a spine, like a promise, like the thing that holds everything else up. She rested her fingertips on the fabric. She heard him cross the room. He came to stand beside her. Not behind her. Beside her. Close enough that she felt the warmth of him along her left arm. Both of them facing the collection. Neither of them speaking. The silence was the kind that had been earned through something real, through archive rooms and early mornings and public rooms and phone calls at 11 p.m. and a week of carrying something too large for one person. She felt him turn slightly toward her. "I have been trying to find the right words since that prep room," he said quietly, in the voice that belonged to no boardroom and no professional context. "Just this room. Just her. I keep coming back to the same place." She waited. "I have spent 10 years being right about things," he said. "Businesses. Decisions. People at a distance." A pause. "I have not been this uncertain about anything in 10 years. She looked at the ivory dress. "You make me uncertain," he said. "The way you looked at me like furniture in that boardroom. The way you said no to me in the archive room with what I am fairly sure was a smile. The way you stood in that conference room when Vries said what he said and you did not move, did not flinch, held yourself like you had decided a long time ago who you were and no one in that room was going to change it." He paused and what came next was quieter and cost him something she could hear. "I have been watching you carry things alone for 3 weeks that you should never have had to carry alone. And I am standing here tonight telling you that I do not want to watch that anymore. I want to be the person beside you. Not for a showcase. Not for 2 weeks in Atlanta. For whatever comes after this room." The words landed in her chest like something she had been waiting for without knowing she was waiting. Her eyes filled. Not spilling. Full. Right at the edge, held with everything she had. And she was not trying to hide it from him and she was not trying to compose herself and she was not counting to 90. She was just standing in the room with her collection surrounding her and her name on every piece and 2 years of carrying and building and protecting and surviving arriving at this exact moment, this exact man, this exact truth. She turned around. He was already looking at her. Clothes like this, in this light. His eyes were the color she had decided on weeks ago. Resolved now, decided, no ambiguity remaining in them at all. And his expression was the most unguarded thing she had ever seen on his face. No boardroom. No composure. Just him. "I was not going to let anyone in," she said. Her voice was steady and clear and only faintly, honestly trembling. "I had a plan and I had a reason for the plan and I had 14 months of proof that keeping things separate was the only way to protect what I was building." She paused. "And then you came and sat in an archive room and listened to me talk about fabric like it was the most important thing you had heard all week, and you made me tea without asking, and you stood up in a room full of people and said my name like it was worth something." She stopped. "And I have been trying for 3 weeks to make the math work. The 7 months and the plan and the keeping things separate." She looked at him. "The math doesn't work anymore." Something broke open on his face. He raised his hand slowly, entirely slowly, giving her every moment to decide. His fingers found her face, warm and careful against her cheek, and she felt it move through her entire body from that single point of contact, from her cheek to her chest to her hands to the floor beneath her feet, the way a note moves through a room when it is the right note at exactly the right moment. She covered his hand with both of hers. She held it against her face. She closed her eyes, just for one moment, just to be entirely present in it. Not managing it, not calculating the cost, not composing herself, not holding anything at arm's length. Just a woman in the middle of everything she had built with the hands of a man she trusted pressed warm against her face, and 2 years of carried weight finally setting down. She opened her eyes. He was still there, right there, looking at her like she was the answer to a question he had stopped knowing how to ask. "Ask me," she said softly. "The question you said you'd ask." He looked at her for a moment that was whole and unhurried and real. "Have dinner with me," he said. "Tomorrow. Not work. Not professional. You and me and somewhere quiet and everything we haven't said yet and as much time as we want." She looked at him. She thought about the kitchen floor, the 11 p.m. phone call, the 2-line email in the morning, the archive room and the tea and the prep room bench and the swatch passed between their fingers. She thought about a conference room where a man had said her name like it was worth defending in front of everyone who needed to hear it. She thought about her grandmother, about doors, about what it costs to keep them closed versus what it costs to open them. "Yes," she said. One word. The largest thing she had said in 2 years. His thumb moved across her cheekbone. Slowly. Once. "The way you touch something you have been afraid of losing." She leaned into it. The smallest amount. The most honest thing she had done in a very long time. The room held them. The collection stood witness. Every piece she had built in the margins of her life, every midnight sketch, every Saturday at the fabric market, every year of carrying herself because she was the only one guaranteed to do it. All of it surrounding her now, bearing her name, in a room where the door was finally, fully open. Not because someone had forced it, because she had chosen. She had looked at what was on the other side and she had decided that she was done protecting herself from things that were not a threat and that this man and this moment and whatever came after this room were worth the cost of choosing. She breathed. Fully. Slowly. All the way down. And the room breathed with her. And Atlanta moved somewhere below the windows. And the thing that had been locked in her for 2 years stood in the open air, and it was not taken, and it was not lost, and it was not used against her. It was held. Simply, warmly, completely held. That was enough. That was everything. If the story found its way into your chest today, if you held your breath at any point, if your eyes got full, if you felt something real, please like this video right now. Leave me a comment and tell me which moment got you the most. Was it the archive room? The conference room when he stood up for her? The kitchen floor at 11 p.m.? The very end? Tell me. I read every single one. Subscribe to this channel so you never miss a story built exactly like this one. Scene by scene, breath by breath, written for you and no one else. Share it with someone who needs to feel something true today. These stories exist because you show up for them, and I am grateful for every single one of you. From the bottom of my heart, thank you for being here. Thank you for watching.